Are you a veteran going through a divorce? Or perhaps you've been a military spouse navigating family law issues. Well, when veterans divorce, it's often a very different experience than the typical divorce pattern. Military service, deployments, PTSD, trauma, and the challenges of reintegration can place extraordinary strain on marriages and families. So today we're diving into the emotional and psychological landscape of veteran divorces. What makes them different? What challenges they present? And what veterans and their spouses need to know to move forward with strength and with understanding. Joining me is a truly exceptional guest who served both on the battlefield and in the courtroom. Honorable Mark Johnson, a retired Superior Court judge and a decorated veteran of the Iraq War. Judge Johnson served as a colonel in the United States Army and was awarded the Bronze Star for his leadership and service in Baghdad. For 11 years, Judge Johnson presided over Riverside County, California's Veterans Treatment Court, where he worked to help those who have served in the military facing legal challenges, often challenges that were tied to PTSD, traumatic brain injury, depression, and other combat-related struggles. Beyond his legal career, Judge Johnson is an advocate for veterans, serving on nonprofit boards and working to support service members in their transition to civilian life. He's also an author, and his debut novel, Scars and Strife, explores the raw and real struggles veterans face when returning home. So let's start part one of the discussion with Judge Mark Johnson.
Hey, we've had some technical difficulties with the audio in this episode, but it is so worth the listen. Thank you for your patience and your support.
Well, Mark Johnson, thank you for joining us here on the Splitting Smart podcast. What a joy to have you here and talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is the law and veterans. You know,
Right.
You spent so much time, more than 11 years, running the Veterans Court here in California for Riverside County Superior Court. So can you tell our audience a little bit about what the Veterans Court treatment program is for those who aren't familiar?
I would love to. I try to advertise our veterans courts because I think they're really important. Veterans court is, they call it a collaborative court. It's like a non-adversarial court that caters to veterans. It has a collaborative team that helps out veterans, and the whole goal is rehabilitation. Ideally, we keep the adversarialness out of the court, and about 90% of the time we're successful. But these programs are designed to rehabilitate veterans, get them back on track after their criminal case, and just see them off to a good life, which they have so richly earned, I think.
Well, and when you say get them back on track, explain how they get themselves into the court system to start with, and how do they land in Veterans Court?
Well, they get in by by the prosecution of a crime. Basically, they committed a crime. What there would be called justice-involved veterans. The case gets filed. Hopefully, if things work well, the lawyer is familiar with the Veterans Court, asks this individual, have you ever been in the military? Once he or she says yes, they come to Veterans Court. You know, what was really nice about that court is very often in our system, we feel like there's just too many cases to do a great job. I hate to admit that, but there's too much. I had calendars of 150 cases a day, and you tell me how on earth I'm supposed to get individual treatment.
You're not.
I'm just trying to get through the calendar. And because if you don't, it gets kicked over to the next day, and you got 180 cases. But in any event, this court focuses on vets. And a vet would come in. I would refer them out for about a month to get psychological evaluations from our Department of Mental Health, report from the VA as to their benefits and any disabilities, and also the probation department would give me a recommendation of suitability for the person and whether they have a criminal record. If we had that kind of information on every case, we could get rid of about half of the crime because we started addressing the root causes.
Right. That's the ever-present question, isn't it? Is how do you really rehabilitate criminals? But we're talking about a little bit of a different situation, because in order to get qualified for Veterans Court? Doesn't there need to be a connection to their military service with a crime?
Yes and no. They had to have a mental health condition related to their service. That's been a big issue over the years with me in my court and nationally on whether you require a nexus, a connection between the crime and the mental health condition. I don't want to get too complicated here, but I described the Veterans Court. We have military diversion, felony military diversion. They have slightly different criteria, but I tell you, I got to the point where I got so sick of hearing lawyers arguing about whether there was a nexus to military service. It became enough for me. Does this man or woman have a condition related to their military service? If I got a yes and they were otherwise suitable, they're in.
They're in. And that's fantastic, because the whole goal of Veterans Court is to bring the treatment, right, the healing, and at the end of the day, expunge the criminal record, isn't it?
As a Veterans Court judge, somebody graduated our program. I did whatever I could legally as a judge to make their criminal record look better. We reduced felonies, the misdemeanors, then expunged the conviction. Yeah. And I feel that the vets that we took in, and the great job they did working on their mental health, I think it really merited it.
What's important here, and the reason why we're talking about it in the context of this Splitting Smart podcast, which, my world is about divorce and mediation and things of that nature, is because when it comes to marriages falling apart involving veterans, I think it's oftentimes it looks to be like it's not, is it related to at all to a veteran's service? The problem can look about a foot wide and 50 miles deep. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
of the background. So that's why it's so important. And I know you saw a lot of what really was going on with veterans, which drove a lot of the behavior that landed them in a criminal situation. So if we can address that and understand that, I think it will help people who have family members who are veterans, who are going through a divorce, whether you're a spouse of a veteran going through a divorce, or you think maybe you're headed down that road, to really understand what a lot of these factors are, that the things that happen to veterans in service, and you had a front row seat to it.
The only reason I laughed is I think in my bio I put there that Johnson was on the front lines of the battle. I was a little dramatic, I must admit.
You're a veteran yourself, and who better than someone like you to run a veterans court? And you have a heart for people, which is huge.
28 years in service. And I tell you, you see some of these 19-year-old kids guarding your rear end when you're over in a war zone, which I was in Baghdad. It's hard not to feel a lifetime obligation to help them if they have problems.
Yeah.
And I really so much appreciate you doing this. Like, a lot of attorneys, they're not attuned to these things at all. They don't even ask them, like in family law, whether they're a veteran until they're maybe filling out some income and expense declaration or something. If they have a mental health condition like PTSD, or that something, especially if the VA is giving them a disability, don't look for a connection to the crime. I used to hear the public defenders arguing any guy who drove by a military installation, there's an nexus sometime years ago, and then the DA wanted the guy to be screaming out the Viet Cong or after me. I was so tired of the arguing from me. I said, no nexus. We're not doing a nexus.
What you're talking about is, there are so many things that can feed into choices that veterans make later in life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a direct, well, this happened to this veteran in this one instance in theater, right? And therefore he committed this crime. There's a lot in between. Can you talk a little bit about, because really we're dealing with PTSD and overall trauma that's occurred. So what kind of cases did you see in the Veterans Court, and really what was standing out in terms of underlying trauma? Can you share some that might have been memorable?
Our Veterans Court started in 2012. The first started in the country in 2008 back in Buffalo, New York. Judge Russell, who's kind of an icon in the collaborative court field, he had a guy stand in front of him. He was running a drug court. And There's drug courts all over the U.S. And there was a guy standing in front of him, and he just couldn't get through to this guy. And he had a veteran working for his court, and the veteran was speaking with the guy, found out that this guy was a Vietnam vet. And Judge Russell describes how after a brief conversation with this vet and another vet, that this guy walked into the court standing proud, looked like a totally different guy, because a lot of these vets, they come into these programs. They just feel like nobody understands them. Judge Russell, based on that, started the first Veterans Court, and then it's spread. There's probably about 300 in the U.S. now, probably about 30 counties of the 58 in California. It's just important. Vets work best with other veterans because they feel like it's somebody that I can talk to who knows what I've been through.
See, and this piece is so huge. I think when a veteran gets into a tough spot and gets the opportunity, because it truly is an opportunity to get into a veterans court, and they get to stand before a judge who's also a vet, and then they're surrounded by other veterans who've screwed up, so to speak.
Yeah.
That sets the stage for you're not alone.
Yeah.
Right?
Someone's got your back.
Someone's got your back. Yeah. It's culturally cool to say, you see a veteran, thank you for your service. I'm not saying you don't say thank you for your service, but I don't think people really understand what your service really meant. And so a diversion program and alternate court like Veterans Court is, I think, also helping to spread awareness to the community of it's much deeper than it appears with veterans. So when we talk about this underlying trauma, what kind of cases stood out in your mind?
The Veterans Court itself, we took largely felonies because there were diversion programs. And diversion program is something where you basically divert the case out of the system. If the vet does a bunch of stuff, come back in a year, get the case dismissed. Now, Veterans Court, we had a big MOU, memorandum of understanding among several agencies, DA, public defender, probation, court, Department of Mental Health, private attorneys, and we were handling the more serious cases. Now, the only exclusions were homicides and sex offenses, largely. Our court had a ton of community support. Attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, robbery, kidnapping. We took a lot of serious charges. I'd say now, I don't want to make the general public think we're just cutting loose a whole bunch of kidnappers. No, I will tell you, the violence cases, I know I'm going to contradict myself a little here. The violence cases, I wanted a little more. I wanted to see a connection to military service. You know, there's some guys out there, they just like beating on women. They lose their temper, they go to their fifth, they go to the weapon that men generally have over a female, and say, I don't want those guys. I don't care if you got the Medal of Honor. I don't want those people because it's not related to military service.
Yeah.
But if I saw a nice guy that was married, decent person, no criminal record, and all of a sudden his young wife says he's come home and I don't recognize the guy anymore, and he hits her, I will bend over backwards to take that if I believe it's related to his military service and military mental health condition.
Because you've seen, and what you're hearing is, this isn't who this was. There's a shift. There's not a background of domestic violence, that sort of thing. Is that what you're saying? This person has had a shift in how they normally are, and so it's probably likely resulting from some kind of trauma that's occurred. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. You asked like examples, and I can give an example of a Marine who was up on the division staff. He was a warrant officer, 3-4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. One time driving through a village in Iraq, from the second story of a building, someone started shooting at him with an AK-47. So they did what Marines do. You're not going to just leave that there for the next convoy to come by. They were going to go and clear the building. Basically means capture or kill the people in there doing it. Well, he ran upstairs, kicked in a door, and there was a bed. The same room the shots came from. There was a bed in the room, and he sees a rifle barrel sticking out from under the bed. So he unloads a magazine, 30 rounds into that. Well, they lifted the bed up. There was a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old. And this is a good man. And and he had trouble living with himself, even though anybody in the
Yeah.
military would have been taught to unload that magazine. But actually, we helped him. He's doing well nowadays, but it took a lot of talking about it.
So he had that unbelievable trauma
Yeah.
occur. So what led him into the Veterans Court? What got him to Veterans Court?
He was a Marine with 24 years. One night in his house on the base, his wife said he was out of it, and suddenly he threw her against the wall. He jammed her, put a hole in the drywall with her head,
Oh, jeez.
shoves her, and is yelling, "Where's your helmet, Corporal?" I guess I want to say to people, I'm going to take that guy. I know people will say it's domestic violence, it's this and that. I'm going to take that guy because I think he's a good guy and we just need to get him on track. And I was right. Sometimes what keeps you up at night is the fear of being wrong. But you know, the important thing about him in his treatment, just for somebody like him, he went into the program, started getting regular psychological treatment. One of the problems is that the Marine Corps, or the 1st Marine Division, put him out with a bad discharge, and he wasn't eligible for VA services. These are all the things you work on, and I guess it really illustrates the point that there's a whole group of problems here. You can deal with PTSD, but then you got to deal with a co-occurring thing, which is generally drug abuse or alcohol abuse.
When you commit an act of domestic violence, a lot of people don't realize it can go and be on a dual course. DV can be handled in the family court, but it's also a crime.
Yeah.
And so he was dealing with, it sounds like, a domestic violence situation in family court, as well as he had a prosecution going on. Now, as a family law attorney who handles domestic violence, and we do quite a few of those cases around here, I think it's really important to understand this, that when you have a veteran, and when it's risen to the level of criminal action, because not all of them, sometimes they're just in family court, the domestic violence action, but often we'll see them go the dual path, and so they're being criminally prosecuted. I don't see many of my colleagues who actually ask the question, should we put this on pause for a minute? I mean, get the protections in place of restraining orders. I think we need to have that happen. But also, when we have a veteran, do they need elevated services? Is this one that is coming out of a service-related kind of situation versus, you and I both know, because you're a veteran doesn't mean that you're not a perpetrator of domestic violence, because, as you pointed out, you just simply like to take your anger out on women. There are those, and there are those of every kind, right? But I think it's important for us in the family law arena to say, wait a minute. What's happening with this veteran? Does he need help? And you get the protections in place, but also encourage the attorney on the other side to say, what are you doing for your client?
I've spoken in terms of criminal law, but one of the first questions a lawyer should ask their client is, have you ever been in the military? And that's how you ask it too. Don't ask are they a veteran. Some of them have a bad discharge or something, or some of them feel like I'm not a combat veteran, so they'll say no.
Oh, that's interesting.
Have you ever been in the military?
Yeah.
That's the question. And then we can take it from there, but, you know, because I've seen miracles. I really have seen miracles. I saw that a good guy retired as a 1st sergeant from the Marine Corps. That's a very high-level sergeant. And he had horrible PTSD. And he assaulted his wife, and she, you know, next thing you know, he's got a ton of restraining orders, and he's got a family law case, and he's got a criminal case, and something with his car, and it's like, it never ends. And a lot of these guys who are kind of overwhelmed with society coming back here in the first place, suddenly now it's like everything's coming in on you and nobody cares. We got him into our court and got him the treatment he needed, talked about a lot of the things he had seen, the people he killed. And nowadays, his ex-wife, they got divorced, but she trusts him so much. He and his son have a good relationship. He gave me a picture at his graduation of him and his son on a camping trip. These were all things that he was losing and lost, and he got back. And his wife trusts him now. She knew what he was capable of beforehand. He now works with vets, and you know, I love this. We create an army of these guys. We get them out there. And they can go help other vets, because, you know, Marines, they want to talk to Marines. if you've been over in a combat zone, that helps. So he's talking to Marines now. He's working for Mighty Oaks. It's a program that they go through graduation after 18 months, and I'm going to do whatever I can to help this vet to make his record look cleaner.
I love that. I think it's so important. And, we're going to link to all of your information and your contact sources and things like that for people who are listening. Because if you have somebody that needs some help, or you might need help yourself, we want people to at least have a resource where they can contact someone to get connected to the right place. And really, that's what we aim to do with folks who have been in military service, even when they're on the other side of a case with us. If we have an inkling that this is, way beyond what the normal pale is, we want to say to opposing counsel, have you gotten your guy contacted with people who can help him? Because our goal as family law attorneys is, believe it or not to bust up as many marriages and drive up our billable hours as much as we can. But, really when you're doing the most service, how do we keep a family together? Yeah. And so our approach has always been, when we're representing somebody who's been violated as a victim of domestic violence, to say to the other side and their counsel, if they have them, the idea isn't to make you the bad guy. The idea is to get you healthy so these kids can have a dad. The idea is to get you healthy so you can go on to, either this relationship or another relationship and not do this again, break the cycle of it. But we can't unless we link arms with people like you and the veterans that you have that serve other veterans.
Hey, before we get back to the show, would you like me to serve as your personal mediator? Where I help you and your spouse or your soon-to-be ex navigate some pretty important family law issues, deciding things about your kids, how to split up your assets, your debts, all outside the chaos of the court. How do we do that? We do it faster, way more economically, and with absolute civility and confidentiality. If you want to know more, go ahead and hit that link below, and you'll find out how you can connect with me, and we can talk about what's most important to you and your future. Yeah, back to the show.
And that's what's so important. So let's talk for a second about, from your time on the bench, the impact that combat-related PTSD has when they come back here and they're in their marriages and they've got their families. What kind of impacts did you see? And I know, for example, you mentioned a moment ago that when a soldier comes home, that there's some impacts that happen when they come from out of combat and now they're back home. Will you share a little bit about, first of all, how that looks different today? I know it's different than when we had folks in World War II and Vietnam, what the transition looks like today and what kinds of things we tend to see because of the transition not being quite as decompressing as it used to be.
In terms of differences, look, a lot of this is anecdotal evidence with me. These are just things I've seen. But, there's a lot of statistics that actually put the level of post-traumatic stress disorder among Iraq, Afghanistan vets is higher than during World War II. Now, I just watched Band of Brothers.
Yeah.
That is a great series. Yeah. That's horrible what those young men and women went through. But it actually puts it higher.
Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, than the others. And I wouldn't have expected that, honestly. A lot of the Vietnam vets, they really, if you want to look at probably the worst example of a bad transition, it was our Vietnam vets. I had a friend who went over as a battalion surgeon in Vietnam. He was patching up our soldiers, patching up Viet Cong, North Vietnamese Army, and then first thing he did when he came back to San Francisco, somebody spit in his face. I think the military is getting better. I would have claimed about 10 years ago. I mean, some of these guys, and women, I say guys for men and women. I don't think there's any kind of grammatical correctness to that. But
don't worry about
some of these guys, they come back, and it's so fast. I mean, I tell you, I left Iraq, went down, sat around waiting for a ride home in Kuwait, and like 72 hours from the time you fly from Baghdad to Kuwait, because I was in my 40s when I employed. I was different than a lot of these young people. I had a little more of a network and everything. But, you know, you get some of these young reservists, they're great. And I'm going to talk about them first because I think they're often the ones who get thrown back into the world the quickest. But, you know, you're sitting there, people are trying to kill you. Maybe you killed somebody, and 72 hours later, you're back home. No real decompression time. In World War II, they used to shove them on a transport ship and let them float across, head across the Atlantic or the Pacific for 3 weeks with other veterans, and there was kind of a decompression period.
And isn't that interesting? Because you identified through Veterans Court that the best thing, or one of the best things about it was that veterans had other vets to talk to, like, and so, but you had that scenario on those ships for 3 weeks with each other.
Now, I may be biased because I was a reservist. I had 28 years in uniform, about 8 active and 20 reserve. I did think that sometimes the problem was the worst in the reserves and guard. But I don't want to take away, you get now the active tends to be a lot younger. They're younger kids, younger people. But, you know, they're also living on base. If they got a family, for instance, their wife or husband and the kids is home with a supportive network of people who are in the same boat, where these reservists, they may be living out in Moreno Valley or something, and there's nobody around who's even been in the military, much less has a relative over there. I don't want to criticize too much because I felt that way back, 20 years ago. The military is getting a lot better with transition programs and that, but I don't know if a lot of people realize who's fighting our wars. They're really, I think, the best Americans, but a lot of them are 19, 20 years old.
They're kids.
They're kids. They're very naive. They don't know how to do things. I will tell you, in our Veterans Court, we had mentors. These are older guys, 50s, 60s, that could talk to this kid, sometimes maybe to square him away, but they were there as kind of a friend. That help them also with these things like how to do a job interview and that stuff's important.
With it being so fast,
I mean,
it's crazy. It's like you wake up and you're in a completely different world, and then we expect them to just adjust.
And I think another problem too is that nobody understands what you've been doing. If you start looking at the statistics from World War II down to now, I mean, it's like 10% of America was in uniform or helping out in some way. Everybody had a family member in the military.
Yeah.
Then you go to Vietnam, it goes down to about 3%. Now it's like it's rare to find anybody. It's like a half of 1%. Yeah. Sometimes a lot of these vets feel like people don't understand their experiences.
As a veteran, when you've gone, on a mission, does the military say, don't talk about it when you get home? Or is there, because it seems like, or maybe it's not said that way, but it seems like there's kind of an understanding among the brotherhood that you don't talk about it. Yeah. Because when you come out of, overseas and all of a sudden you're put right back in your home within 48, 72 hours, whatever it is, it seems like they don't talk about it very much.
There are some jobs, the special ops guys, where they're not supposed to talk about it. Yeah. That old joke about I'll have to kill you if I tell you. But let me say, that was not my thing. I was free to talk about whoever, pretty much. But I will tell you, sometimes a lot of vets feel uncomfortable talking with people who they don't think are going to understand at all. I remember I got back, some guy asked me if I carried a gun over there. I feel like going, sure as hell carried a gun. Are you serious? No, I wasn't going to carry a gun. I said, the problem is I was at a table full of defenders, and I think out of about 7 of us, 6 of them all thought this was a reasonable question to ask a man.
It's like this weird catch-22. So you have the public now who really doesn't know what military service is the way our culture did years and years ago, Korea, Vietnam, World War II. And then you've got what I think, or I suspect, is a culture of really not talking about it to civilians. I told you we had limited veterans in our family, and the one I knew and was closest to was my grandfather, who passed away a number of years ago at 87 or 88. Yeah. He was a tough guy. He was Army, and want to say he was 22 years old, 23 years old, and he was in the group that they were going in to the front lines in France after D-Day.
Yeah.
And getting into Germany, and then he ultimately was in the Freedom. Is it battalions? I'm going to get it
like
wrong.
The occupying army?
Well, where they went in and they went into the camps. So, but I tell you this to say, he never talked to his family about it. And probably about 3 or 4 years before he died, he and I were sitting in the living room. I was visiting with him. He lived far away, so I didn't see him often. And we start talking. And I have this funny little gift and skill that we always laugh and say, people tell me things. People do. So for whatever reason, he shared with me that he still took Valium and still had night terrors at 87, 88 years old. And he shared with me a little bit about what happened over there. And as I talked to my family and my dad about it, my dad was just dumbstruck because he said he never told anybody that. In all of those years, my dad didn't even know that.
A good friend of mine is Virginia Blumenthal's a big-time lawyer up in Riverside. But her dad, she describes the same thing with her dad. Dad was a Navy hero, and their ship was getting hit all the time, and he never talked about it. I do think a lot of people, I think there's a little bit of a two-way street, because a lot of people won't ask it either. They don't know, I'm not supposed to say anything. I'm not supposed to ask. Just ask them. They don't have to answer. Ask them, but sometimes you probably do want to talk about it, especially if, like what you did, especially if it's a family member, so you can pass on, I think, this heroism to your kids.
Oh, huge. He was a huge hero, but the family didn't really know it.
A lot of times you're afraid to ask them, too.
What would you say would be a couple of good questions? I'm going to put you on the spot, all right?
I'm the guy who opened his mouth. In fact, that's that gift you have there. I never would have said that to anybody else. That's a joke.
So if you say, ask them, well, what would be a good question to ask that other than, did you have a gun?
They don't ask the questions. They don't ask them. And the vet's not talking about it. I had a good friend of mine, it's a guy named Ken Haley. Ken came to our court, and he was kind of a mess. He was a real mess. And I know Ken's a good friend. He doesn't mind me. I've written an article about him. But Ken was a Marine, 2 Purple Hearts, shot in the chest. And he came back. He got put out, kind of lost. This is one of those guys. He's all Marine. He was a staff sergeant, all Marine. And he was having adjustment problems. Ken was having such bad nightmares that he started setting his alarm to go off every 2 hours so he wouldn't go into REM sleep. I said, Ken, I think you kind of need that sleep, don't you? But he read. And then he had problems with substances. You need REM sleep. If you don't get it, you'll go crazy.
So he was afraid that I just don't want to go there.
He picked up some serious assault charges and drug charges. Well, these are one of our success stories because Ken was granted, he set a record. The program was 18 months. It took him 3 years to graduate. Now, Ken, as of fall 2023, he had 7 years of sobriety. He met this nice lady who rescues dogs and works with hospice patients. Met her at his church. Asked me to perform their wedding ceremony, which I did in November 2023. Ken is now a pastor of a church. If there's one thing I could say, if you've got a family member, you got a vet in your family needs help, maybe it's you, ask for that help. But secondly, I saw miracles in there. You get the right treatment. You tell me, what other court on earth are you going to find the judge performing a wedding ceremony for a guy who was in before him on felony?
Right. You're not. And this discussion isn't just for folks, not just, but isn't limited to folks who have had some criminal problems. Because what we're saying here is you may not run into criminal problems, but the point is get help when this stuff is happening. You saw all levels from, I don't want to call it PTSD light, but where the symptoms were not as severe, doesn't mean it wasn't as serious, to severe PTSD where it was just getting in this veteran's way. So for someone who's dating or married to a veteran, what are kind of the signs of PTSD, whether it's light PTSD or heavy duty to the point where, life is completely disrupted?
But in the bench, I used to keep cheat sheets up there.
Yeah.
Okay? But
I'm gonna put the camera out so we can see
Okay.
that you're looking at your cheat
okay,
sheets.
now, let me tell you, this is a great site. This is from the National Center for PTSD. It's part of the VA. They're great. But okay, to get to the point where there's a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm going to tie this into some of those things. You need the traumatic event. I've been talking men, but I tell you, sexual trauma is a problem in the military. That happens to women and more than I would ever like to hope in the military.
Yeah, and let me ask this before you go on. So as you saw female soldiers come into your courtroom, were there any in that program that had not been victims of sexual assault in the military? Or was it the majority?
Every female who came into the Veterans Court that I dealt with had been the victim of something. The VA will give you statistics that 25% of the women who come to the VA, and that now mine is what we call anecdotal evidence. I kind of was afraid of that as a guy, as a male. Well, I just feel like I'm going to ask something insensitive. My personality tends to be kind of a big, rough around the edges personality, and I'm afraid I'm some little young female there. I'm going to scare the crap out of her. That's serious. And so, but I will tell you, I had some great ladies that worked with me, and they'd be the ones to go talk. And I would always ask them, how should I address her in court? And that helped.
Yeah.
But you got to have the trauma. See your buddy blown up. I was diagnosed with PTSD. I saw a car bomb right after all this field of body parts. And some type of trauma. Then you've got to have people kind of re-experience things they see. And I'll give an example. I had a vet in my court who he saw his buddies blown up, and he was smelling exhaust at the time. Now, the trauma of the event gets attached to the smell of exhaust. So this guy, he'd be out on the road and smell a bunch of exhaust. And he might have a flashback to Fallujah back in 2006.
Wow.
The one we often see is this hypervigilance.
What does hypervigilance look like?
Okay, I'll tell you another one. I, for a while, was doing these firearm hearings. And that's, if you lose your firearm in California, welfare and institutions 5150 hold, that's danger to self or others.
Right.
You lose your firearm rights first time, 5 years automatically. But you can petition the court to get them back earlier. Well, this Marine sergeant with 3 combat tours, his wife walked in, found him with a loaded 9mm contemplating suicide. And they had a small child. And he called the police. Of course, they took him in 5150. Oh, he lost his firearm rights. So 5 months later, he's sitting in front of me, and he wants his firearm rights back. And he's crying. And he's saying that I can't protect my family. I live in a bad area of Lake Elsinore. I can't protect my family. But he's sitting at the counsel table, and the door of the courtroom's back there, and there's a deputy here, but he's like jerking. It's like constantly looking back. He's got a big open area behind him, and he's constantly looking back.
Yeah. Wow.
And I remember him talking about protecting his family, and I said, Sergeant, here's the problem. I'm afraid you're going to shoot a trick-or-treater. I called up our county vet center. One of their reps came over. I told this Marine, tell you what, you talk to this guy. You go get treatment for your post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll see you in 2.5. I'll give you your firearm rights if you're doing well back halfway through the 5 years. Well, I forgot about the guy. About 2 years later from that point, here he's back again. And he comes in. He's got a therapy dog. His wife's there with their child. And he was like a different guy. He said he got the treatment. He's doing a lot better. A lot of these guys too. We find the root of it. He was having a hard time forgiving himself. Sometimes you feel like you let your buddies down and they got killed. That survivor's guilt is a killer for these guys.
Yeah.
But his wife, I actually had her testify, and she said he's a different guy. He's not hyper vigilant anymore. They had him on medication. And I gave his firearm rights back. This was a different man who came in there. And he also said that dog was this little yellow lab, like the one you got running around your office.
Yeah.
This dog was part of it. I don't want to get choked up, but that's the time you kind of feel like as a judge, you actually did something that helped somebody, because often you don't have that feeling. You feel like you're just moving a vast amount of cases through the system. Then finally his wife says, Your Honor, I would like him to be a little more romantic and stuff. I said, that was a question. I said, man, you married a Marine. Let's not push it, okay? I said, he's doing well. I thought that was funny. What a thing. I'd like him to be a little more romantic.
And what a beautiful story. And I hope our cameras caught you being a little bit choked up. You know why? Because I think it shows people need to understand how important this is. And when you are put, I know you feel the same way I do about our roles. I feel like when we're put in these positions as a lawyer or a judge, it is a phenomenal responsibility that we have when you recognize it. And then when you do recognize it, and you're a Mark Johnson who brings gifts to bear in that, those are your skills and gifts that God's given you, no doubt about it. And look, you're changing lives by just showing up and doing what you do. Yeah. So I can't thank you enough for it, because I've seen it firsthand. You know, it's beautiful.
I would even add to that, you got to have guts too, because there's a lot of people who are telling you shouldn't do this, guy's violent and that. And I tell you, screw them. You do the right thing, and because they're always going to be whispering in your ear, telling you don't do this.
Yeah. Well, we have a saying around here: just always do the right thing and let God take care of the rest. Talk about emotional detachment for a minute. What about that? Do you see that?
I dealt with some issues. I'd be sitting in bed. It'd be a nightmare. I'd be seeing like body parts and stuff, and sitting at the end of the bed. What is it? Nothing. And then I go sit out there, maybe down about 4 shots. And I just realized, you know, one of the things we say to a lot of veterans is sometimes they don't even know they got PTSD. And I guess as I see you were talking to you, Kelly, I guess I was one of them, because I just thought, I don't know if I thought it was normal. I just didn't, you know, you kind of feel like you're kind of a badass guy, and I don't want to be sitting there saying I'm having these problems. So, but when you're sitting up in the middle of the night, taking 5 shots of vodka or tequila to go back to sleep, that's I realize it is emotional avoidance. And I see a lot of vets. I tell them now, I try to tell them about that, and I tell them, look, if you're out in the garage drinking yourself to death, you got to ask for help, because, you know, the asking for help, the getting of the help is very liberating. They can find freedom, but they got to talk. Right. They got to bring it to us. We can help them.
Yeah, and that emotional detachment thing, you hit the nail on the head. I think it comes with avoidance like crazy. And in the personal development world, I know that Tony Robbins, and through his business mastery program, they teach away from values and running toward values. Away from values really go to avoidance. And so we'll do anything to not have to, whatever it is makes you uncomfortable. And that's kind of what was happening with you. I'd rather go take a shot and tell my wife, no, it's nothing, right? Yeah. And avoid the conversation. Yeah. So because I value avoiding it, these are the behaviors that I choose versus I value dealing with it head on and talking to somebody about it who can understand, so that I can address this freaking pain and get past it, right? So that's kind of the difference between an away from value, moving away from it, avoiding, and a moving towards it value. And I had a friend of mine recently who was in a very high-powered position, and he'd been in this job for 16, 17 years, and he wanted to move on to something else and kind of retire from that and go into, something else. And I knew he was thinking about the retirement for quite some time, and I'm pretty close friends with him. And he texts me and tells me on a Monday that his last day at the job is on Wednesday. and I'm moving out of state in a week. And it was a little shocking. And the reason I'm sharing this with you, because it was like, well, wait a minute. And so this strange behavior kind of developed.
Yeah.
And I learned that he didn't even tell his colleagues he was leaving until the Friday before.
Yeah.
Right. So it was like this sudden kind of crazy situation. As I talked to him a little more about it, because I kind of got ruffled by, I thought we were friends. What are you doing? You're just leaving and you're not saying goodbye. And we had the conversation. And he said to me, when we got off texting, we got on the phone, and I said, what is this?
Yeah.
And his response was, a lot of people don't know this about me. You know some of it, but I was raised very, very poor. And my parents got evicted all the time.
Yeah.
We were raised up in East LA, and we were moving all the time. He said, when I was in second grade, I went to 6 different schools because we moved so much.
Wow.
And I learned not to attach to people.
Huh.
And saying goodbye is not my forte.
Yeah.
So we had a discussion about, do you see how that's a moving away from value? I'll do all these things over here to avoid saying goodbye, because I learned as a child that it's really painful to attach to people and then have to constantly move on and start. So that's what this reminds me of, is that that's an extreme case of emotional detachment.
Yeah.
And then we translate it over to veterans. I'm telling kind of a long story about that, but
Yeah. I've seen vets like that. They'll sit around talking, and like, I've talked to guys who've killed 50 people.
Mm.
Sometimes I've talked to guys, and you'd think they were talking about washing the car or something. I mean, we asked them to do some pretty horrific stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they're going to try in their mind, and I'm not speaking as a mental health professional here, but they're going to try in their mind to kind of sanitize it, and they'll talk about it. But this guy talked about it like it was, like I said, when he was washing the car or something. Like
Yeah.
that. Just it was all part of a day's work. That's not a part of a day's work. That friend Ken I told you was back in Oklahoma, and I'll have to tell him to watch this. Hi, Ken. That was some of his problem there. He didn't want to face the stuff. One of the recognized treatments is cognitive processing therapy for this, for PTSD. And one of the things he did in the therapy was he wrote about all of his trauma, and he said he filled up about 30 pages. And then he said, then the hard part I had to read out loud. We got to get it out in the open. We can kill it if you get it out in the open.
boy, are these important things to know if you've got a veteran in your family and all of a sudden they're detached, or, all these things are so important to understand and go, well, wait a minute, what's going on? Instead of just saying, he came back different, he's not the same person.
Well, avoidance in terms of PTSD is referring to like avoiding places or things that remind you, but they'll also avoid talking about it. And, you got some young lady who's probably not that much life experience, not that easy at dealing with this stuff. And here's, like I said, here's the guy, and he won't talk to you.
Yeah.
He just won't talk to you. I would imagine a lot of resentment builds up because
Sure.
here's okay, our marriage is going down the tubes and you're not talking about it.
The human response to that is getting angry and why won't you talk to me? You don't value me, all of these things.
Yeah.
But it's probably none of those things, right?
Some of these guys, they go take a bullet for the female easier than they can talk about this stuff. And, Kelly, one thing I want to say, if you get lawyers, they want to talk to me, I'll do whatever I can, and I'm cheap. I don't charge anything. If you got a vet coming in here, I'm happy to sit down with you and talk to you. I'm not a therapist, but I have worked with a lot of vets. And one thing I do have, I got a lot of connections. I have a lot of connections to people who can help a veteran who needs some help. You got your dad or your brother sitting out in the garage with some half-gallon of liquor, pounding it down in 2 days.
Yeah, it's time to talk to someone.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to them.
I think that's fantastic. Why is there such a big substance abuse problem? What's it doing for the vet? Why are they running down that road so quickly?
Well, it's about double the rate among veterans as it is for the rest of the population. Same thing with the suicide rate. Now, this is a little I'll say this, a little anecdotal, but this has been my experience. You know, I remember I talked to a young lady who was addicted to methamphetamine. She had PTSD. She'd been raped on active duty. And I asked her, what are you getting out of that meth? I mean, you know, that is the most destructive drug. If the devil's got a hand in things,
Right.
he developed that. And she said, I felt like crap all the time. And that made me feel good. And, you know, one thing I think a lot of us don't understand is, unless you've been there, is that, you know, these substances work. They actually do work. I can remember at some situation where great grief in my life, and I used to make jokes that alcohol got me through it.
This brings us to the end of part 1 of my discussion with Judge Mark Johnson. Stay tuned for part 2.